All right, I'm going to call to order the school board meeting, Independent School District number 283, 6:30, special meeting. This is our Truth and Taxation meeting. On our agenda, we have the Truth and Taxation hearing. And is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Jim, seconded by Ann. All in favor?
Aye.
Carries 7-0. And so our presenter tonight is Patricia Magnuson, Director of Business Services.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Gores, Superintendent Osai, and members of the board. This is the public hearing for taxes payable in 2020 for St. Louis Park Public Schools. Minnesota state law requires that we hold a hearing like this, and you can see that on the left-hand side here that it's required to be a public meeting, and we meet all of the requirements that are established in state law, and the intention is that the board will adopt the levy later this evening, and that we have to present the current year's budget, prior year actual revenues and expenses, the percentage increase in our property tax levy, and some of the specific purposes behind the changes in the levy. So we'll go through these four things tonight. A little bit of information about school funding that helps provide context for the tax levy. We'll go through the district's budget as required, and then the proposed levy for taxes payable in 2020, and we will allow time for public comment. And just for the record, we've been through the tax levy presentation a couple of times in public with the board, and then also at the preliminary levy presentation back in September. The context for the tax levy is that the Minnesota Legislature sets all of the funding for Minnesota public schools, and part of that is that there would be a uniform system of public schools, and that there are provisions for taxation to provide for the funding of public schools. So that's the context within which our local tax levy sits. What happens then as a result is that school funding is highly regulated. The state sets all of the formulas that determine revenues, and most of them are a per pupil amount. The legislature also sets tax policy for schools, and then within that they set the maximum authorized property tax levy. And there are a couple of areas where school districts are allowed to ask voters for additional approval, but aside from those couple of areas, all of the funding formulas are established within state law. So a key point about tax levies is that a change in the tax levy doesn't equate to a change in a school district's budget. If tax levies go up, it doesn't mean that spending goes up in school districts, or vice versa. If tax levies go down, it does not mean that the budget has gone down. The two are not that well correlated. So the tax levy itself is based on many state-approved formulas and some voter approval. Sometimes increases in tax levies are revenue neutral because of a thing called equalized funding. So if a funding formula is split between aid and levy, a change in law might cause a tax levy portion of a formula to go up so that the state aid contribution goes down. Nothing has changed about school funding in that case. It's just that the split of a formula has changed. The spending for a school district is limited by all of those formulas set in state law. Expenditures aren't set by the amount of the tax levy. So we as a administration can't recommend a change in spending to the board that would result in a change in the tax levy, because spending is limited by the amount that's set in the formulas. And so again, that a change in school taxes doesn't really have an automatic change in the school budget. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We are required to talk about our budget, and school districts are a unique animal. For cities and counties that are also proposing taxes at the same time as school districts, their budget year aligns with the calendar year or the tax year, so it's a little bit easier for them to talk about the budget that's connected with the tax levy. But for school districts, because our fiscal year starts in the middle of the tax year on July 1st to correlate with the school year, we haven't yet set the budget for next year. So what's happening is that what we're talking about tonight are taxes that are payable next year in the tax year 2020, provides revenues for next fall's school year. So for the fiscal year 2020-21, And that budget we're working on, and the board will not formally adopt that budget until June. So the budget we'll talk about tonight is the budget that we're currently in the current year. So we'll talk a little bit about the current year budget. And this is an overview that shows you all of the different funds that school districts are required to budget in. The majority of the funding, the things that folks think about when you think about a school district and the day-to-day operations of schools, that activity happens in the general fund. And just as we look at this list for a minute, I just want to point out that the first fund, the general fund, then the third fund down, which is the community service fund, that's where you see lifelong learning, early childhood and adult learning, our after-school care. And the third fund is the debt service fund. The fifth one on the list, those are the three funds that have taxes and tax levies as a portion of their revenue. So this tax hearing tonight really only has an impact on three of these many funds in which the school district operates. This is a busy slide, but it meets a lot of the requirements for this presentation tonight. We talk about the budget in great detail in public, and we talk about the tax levy in great detail in public. And so for purposes of tonight's hearing, we're using this required district revenue and expenditure spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is on the school district website, and it also is required to be published in a local newspaper. That's one of the requirements, even though it is on the district's website. What it highlights here is last year's ending fund balance as of June 30th, 2019, the beginning fund balance, and then revenues and expenses for last year, the 18-19 year, and the actual ending fund balance. And then it gives the summary by fund of our proposed budget for this current year, the 19-20 school year. So everything for last year is here. There's a detailed audit report also on the school district website that gives more detail about that. And then the budget for next year. And there's an entire budget book also linked on the school district website for more information about that. We're going to talk just a little bit about the current year's budget. So we're in the 19-20 budget year. That's the current school year. The tax levy that's being proposed tonight is for next year, just as a reminder of that. And what you see here, of all of the funds listed, as we said, the general fund is where the majority of school operations reside. It's about 75.7% of the revenue in all of the funds, which makes sense. So I'm going to talk now just about the general fund. So if you look at general fund revenue, the majority of the revenue in the general fund, about 64%, is state aid. And where you're going to see the local tax levy, it's within that 32.9% of local funding. The remainder is some other funding like interest earnings and other things like that, and federal funding. Now I'm just going to break down expenditures first by program area. And this first set of expenditure categories are the programs that are set in state law, and it's the mechanism that we have to use to report our budgets so that we can compare one district to another. If you combine regular instruction, which is about 45.9%, vocational instruction, special education, instructional support, and pupil support services, all those areas that are directly linked to students, that's about 80% of the budget. Everything in the budget is linked to students and is here to support student achievement, but about 80% of the budget is directly day-to-day students. Obviously, 10% is within our sites and buildings and supporting the lights and the heat, and the facilities themselves also directly support students, but that's about 10% of the budget. Administration, about 4% of the budget. And then the support services of the district, such as running payroll, human resources, other types of support for the district itself, also supporting student achievement, however, are about 7% of the budget. If you take that same exact general fund budget, you can see the total, $69,741,000. This is just a different way of looking at that budget. This one is a common way of thinking about a school district's budget. If you combine salaries and wages and employee benefits, we are a people-intensive business in school districts. Over 80% of the budget, 85% of the budget is with staff, teachers, custodians, other administration, support staff within school districts. Purchase services, a lot of that is our transportation budget. Some of our utilities is about 13% of the budget, and then there's small amounts in supplies and materials, capital expenditures, and other types of spending. So that's the 1920 budget in the general fund. Now I'm going to just cover the taxes payable in 2020, our proposed property tax levy, and how we got to that and some of the changes. And the board has heard about these and should be very familiar with these changes. We talked about it at the last time we were together. So what happens with property taxes is that every owner of taxable property in St. Louis Park Public School District pays a portion of property taxes that support the public schools. And there's other taxing jurisdictions other than the school district. There's the county, the city, and the township, and other special taxing districts. And each taxing jurisdiction has the obligation to set its own tax levy, oftentimes limited in state law. Hennepin County, in our case, the county sends out the tax bills and they do the collection of taxes, and then they distribute funds back to school districts. This is an example of a parcel specific notice, and just to keep in mind that we are only talking about the school district portion of that tax levy. These were delivered sometime in the middle of November to property tax owners in Hennepin County. So here's how school district property taxes work. There's about 40 different categories of funding and funding formulas, and there are levy limits. Amounts that we cannot surpass within each of the categories. They're either set in state law or they're set by our voters through voter approval. And these limits are established by the Minnesota Department of Education. So here's what has been happening that has led toward tonight's public hearing and then ultimately our tax levy. Back on September 8th, the Department of Education distributed a first draft of our levy limits. We talked to the board at that time, and then on September 23rd, the board approved the proposed levy. And then in mid-November, those parcel-specific notices were mailed to each taxpayer. And we have talked to the board a couple of times since then about the tax levy at a couple of public meetings, and here we are tonight doing our public hearing on the proposed levy. And following tonight's hearing, the school board will hold a regular meeting and will certify the final levy amounts. So this is an overview now. I'm going to go through of the St. Louis Park Public Schools proposed levy for taxes payable in 2020. The total dollar amount of the levy is going up by about $515,939, or precisely, not about, precisely that amount, which is about 1.6%. And so we're going to just talk about the reasons behind those changes. These spreadsheets should look familiar. We've been looking at these for a few months. The lines that are highlighted are the lines that I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about. But this first page just shows the totals in the general fund. The first column is our proposed taxes payable in 2020 within the general fund. The second column is last year's, or the year that we're in, taxes that were payable in 2019. And you can see on the general fund, there's a proposed decrease in the tax levy of $691,000, or 3.32%. That's in the general fund. And then, as we said earlier, there's two other funds within which we levy taxes for revenue components. One is the Community Service Fund. And again, you can see the first column is the proposed 2020 taxes. The second column is the 2019 taxes that were levied. And there's a $24,000 change in the Community Service Fund, which is about 2.5% in that fund. And then in the Debt Service Fund, the proposed taxes for 2020 are $11.8 million. Last year's taxes that have been levied are $10.7 million, and the difference is $1.2 million. And that's a change of about 11%. We'll talk a little bit about the details in those items as well. I'm not going to, as you can see, I have not highlighted anything in community service, so I'm not going to talk about any details following this summary presentation about community service, since the dollar amounts were so small. So I'm just going to jump back here real quick. So in the general fund, we're going to talk about the operating referendum levy authority. That's one of the line items that changed. That's a voter-approved item. We're also going to talk about the capital project referendum and why that dollar amount has changed, also a voter-approved item. And then the next items down the page, we're going to talk about other post-employment benefits. We're going to talk about long-term facilities maintenance in the general fund, building leases, and then something called prior year levy adjustments. So in the general fund, and then in debt service, we're going to talk about the debt associated with long-term facility maintenance and other post-employment benefits. So the first item is our voter-approved operating referendum, which is now combined because of a change in state law with local optional revenue. And that line item is actually going down by $343,000. The reasons for the change, the legislature combined local optional revenue and our voter-approved operating referendum. So that alone isn't causing that decrease. That's sort of a revenue-neutral item. Our voter-approved operating referendum includes an inflationary increase. So intuitively, you would think that this line item would be going up. But the reason there's a decrease is that there are adjustments based on previous year's enrollments. So this is an example in a year where enrollment had been projected to be at one place but actually declined. The tax levy last year and perhaps the year before were levied at a certain dollar amount, and if enrollments declined in previous years, we have to reduce the tax levy in a future year. So that's what's happening here. So as these formulas change and as our numbers are trued out, adjustments will be made. So now this year, just foreshadowing for next year, our enrollment was higher than we thought when we set the tax levy that is for this year. So I might anticipate those adjustments won't have happened yet. So you could anticipate an increase in this line item if that were the only thing that impacted the operating referendum. So that all of these items are trued up year over year. This next line item is the capital project referendum, which is our technology levy that has been in place for several years. That is going up by $199,000. And as you can see, it's used for technology expenses. And our voters approved a tax rate, which is 3.812%. So there was a line item on the ballot that asked our voters to approve funding for technology at 3.812% of net tax capacity. And we are a growing tax capacity school district. Our property values are increasing, so the funding is also increasing in technology, and this is a voter-approved funding item. The next item is for other post-employment benefits, and that change looks similar to the other number, but it's $199,426. And this is to help fund the cost of post-employment benefits for eligible employees. And it's important to note that this benefit is no longer in place and has been removed from contracts since the 1990s. But we continue to have employees who are retiring under those benefits that were previously in place. This is the first year the district has utilized this funding source. And you can see that we are 50% funded. So we can only levy 50% of what we are eligible for in this category, what the costs are in this category. So that's what this line item represents. The next item in the general and debt service funds, we're combining the items associated with long-term facility maintenance. In the general fund, we're dropping a pay-as-you-go levy to cover long-term facility maintenance and funding instead through a bond issue that is funded through the debt service fund. And those two items, net of adjustments, are the explanation for the changes in long-term facility maintenance. These items are deferred maintenance on all of our buildings and are based on state-approved projects. So each deferred maintenance project has to be approved by the state. And the commitment we have made with the board and with our community is that as we implement these types of changes, that the net impact of capital associated projects wouldn't increase taxes. And that's the case with this one as well. There's another item in the general fund for building leases. That change is an increase in the total levy of $299,000. And that line item is, the lease levy is for spaces that are required for students that are leased. And this includes the potential lease purchase for turf fields to put a turf field on the track at the interior of St. Louis Park High School, while we are already updating the track at the high school through another project funding. We are able to fund that project through lease purchase. It's a area that needs improvement for our students, for access for our community, and it's in this proposed levy. It doesn't mean that the turf project has been approved. The board has a couple of more stages to go through. And like I explained in the operating referendum, if this project isn't completed, the levy would be removed as an adjustment in a future levy. The last item in the general fund are prior year adjustments, and that's a reduction in the general fund levy of $311,000. And that's just a combination of several different levies. There was one line item of levy last year that was reduced in this year. Otherwise, we try to combine them with other line items within the levy. So this year we had more negative adjustments than we had positive adjustments. And these line items are combined and will go up or down in any given year. In the debt service fund, it's notable that we had a bond issue for other post-employment benefits that we're picking up now in a pay-as-you-go levy. There was a one-time window to issue bonds for OPEB costs about 10 years ago, and we made the final payment on that debt last year. So this reduction just is showing that there's no more payments for other post-employment benefits this year. So that's a reduction of over $800,000 in the debt levy. So now I want to just talk about how that 1.6% increase in the tax levy might impact an individual taxpayer. And here's some of the factors. An individual property owner might have an increase or actually a decrease in the market value or the tax capacity then of their property. There could be a change in the entire value of the entire school district, which is a benefit to an individual property tax owner. And there could be increases or decreases in the levy amount. And as we've talked about before, a tax rate is just a math problem. It's a numerator, which is the total tax levy, a denominator, which is all of the property in St. Louis Park Public Schools, and that creates a ratio that's applied against an individual property owner. We are in a good position because that denominator in that formula, the total property tax, or the total property values are increasing. And so our tax rates are declining for school taxes. So what we're going to show you are some 4-year school levy comparisons. And there's a lot of details in here, but our examples over 4 years is that someone's property value might go up by 16.3% over 4 years. Now, if an improvement is made to a piece of property, it might go up faster than that. An individual property value might actually be going down over that 4-year period of time. But what we're trying to do is look at overall values and make a fair representation of what might actually happen for a piece of property. All of these estimates were prepared by Ehlers & Associates. It's our municipal financial advisor. So this is a busy table, but what I want to show you here are really the highlighted columns. So if you look at the groupings, you've got residential or homestead properties, and then some values for commercial properties at the bottom of the spreadsheet. And as you look, the two highlighted columns are the market value for taxes payable in 2020, and then the estimated taxes for taxes payable in 2020 for school district portion of property taxes for all of those different values. And this, between taxes payable in 2019 and taxes payable in 2020, assumes a 6% increase across the board. And what you see on the far right-hand side is if a property increased in value by 6% within any of those categories, we either have a decline in the actual school taxes, or I think it goes as high as a $1 increase. Last time we were together, I showed you an example of 3 different actual property tax statements from residents in St. Louis Park. All of those had values that increased more than 6%. So we saw something a little bit bigger than this, but based on the average across the district, Ehlers and Associates recommended that we show a 6% increase in value across the board. There should be a negligible or no increase in just the school district portion of taxes. I'm not reporting on any other taxing jurisdiction. So then these are some details. So it pulls out a few property values from that larger table and shows a $200,000 home. Really, it's a push. The taxes on that $200,000 home, if the home increased in value by 6%, the taxes are the same for next year as they are this year for the school district portion. A $300,000 home would have a slight decrease in its school district portion of property taxes. You can see a $500,000 home, and then a $1 million commercial industrial piece of property would also have the same tax impact. And again, that's based on a 6% across the board increase in individual properties because we have a declining tax rate. And again, I showed you 3. Last time we were together, none of them went up by just 6%. So it will depend on an individual property owner. The tax rates have gone down, however. So here's our next steps. We'll listen to public comment, or the board will accept public comment on the proposed levy, and then we'll adjourn the tax hearing, and the board will convene in its regular meeting. And our plan is to certify the taxes payable in 2020 at that regular meeting later. So at this time, we can take some public comment on the tax levy.
So Patricia, are you saying that the total levy, you did a lot of individual components of the levy, but the total levy impact is an increase of 1.6%?
Yes.
Okay.
And we talked about that at the very beginning of the presentation. Thanks.
Okay. Just want to make sure that I was listening properly. So is there any public comment that anybody would want to make? If you do, you can step up to the mic and we'll hear any public comments. Patricia, you've explained this several times over the course of several meetings, and we don't have anybody here to make a public comment, so take us to the next step.
Okay, so we'll close the meeting then tonight, or you will close the meeting, and we'll move on to the board meeting.
Right. Is there a motion to close the Truth and Taxation hearing? Moved by Ken. Is there a second? Seconded by Karen. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. It's closed by a motion of 7-0 at roughly 7:02.